we're not taught relating in school. Very seldom. I think, like, let's just throw a number. Probably like 0.001% of education platforms actually teach it in schools. I think it's also ironic that you get to be like 15 and 16 and all of a sudden you're like, oh, I guess I'm just going to enter relationships and be good at them. Yet there's been no outside intervention to teach you. So you replicate the relational patterns of your parents generally and what you've learned in romantic comedies and Disney and also probably pornography too. So this is how we're informed till we start to actually look and learn and start to take courses or listen to podcasts like yours. And so the purpose when you look at the long-term impact of healthy relating versus unhealthy relating, there's a study done by Harvard. It's the longest running study looking at well-being. And it shows that the greatest predictor of your health at 80 is actually the quality of your relationships at age 50. So not your blood pressure, not your cholesterol, the quality of your relationships, and not just your romantic relationships, any type of relationship. So that shows you that how we relate has a dramatic impact on our health. So relationships and their purpose in our lives is, you also said this too, is to be a mirror to our potential, because any trigger or any friction in relationship is an opportunity for you to grow. And I could tell you when I was younger, when I got feedback from a partner, I wasn't thinking, oh, this is amazing. Thank you so much for the mirror of my possibility.
You weren't? I don't understand.
Definitely not. I remember complaining to my dad once on the phone about my girlfriend in my like early 20s. And my dad said to me, oh my God, Mark, she was complaining about something which she had the right to complain about. So if you're listening, you were valid. And I said to her, well, it's so bad. I don't even want to say what I said, but hey, it's all about growth. I'm very different now. But I said, well, if it's so bad, why don't you leave? I told my dad I said this, and he was like, Mark, oh my God. And I remember I didn't necessarily understand what he was saying at the time. But it's one of those seeds that plants in your psyche. Yeah. He said, a relationship is a separate entity. There is you and there is her. And then there is the investment in the separate organism. And what you just did was not invest in it. And
wow.
Yeah. And I think when we can start to see that feedback from a partner, if delivered in a healthy way, is actually an invitation to our evolution. And the purpose of relationships from a biological perspective is we need other people. Like when you are lonely, the same parts of your brain light up as when you experience physical pain. And what is posited about that is that it will draw you to seek out help, to seek out others. So we are tribal by species, by nature, and we need other people. And I think what got confused and still does in the language of don't need nobody, don't need a man, all that stuff, which is valid from the cultural experience of divorce and financial abuse and all that kind of stuff, is that you do need somebody. But when you depend on somebody who's unhealthy and you place your well-being and your self-worth in another person's hands who is not reliable, you're gonna get hurt. And so I don't think as a culture, we're coming back, but I don't think as a culture we really explain that nuance, especially to young girls and to young boys. And so what happens is we don't necessarily have the ability to, like, the greatest struggle people have is, how do I be in a relationship and maintain who I am? Most of us give up ourselves for love or give up relationships to maintain self.
Ooh. Yeah. And you actually, that's so powerful, because where my brain is really grabbing onto is this idea that there's actually three entities in a relationship. There's each individual and then there's the relationship. Yeah. And I think you could probably say that about friendship. You could probably say that about work relationships. So if you look at those three entities and you're somebody who's into self-growth, which I feel deeply that that's your plight in life, is a growth mindset. So you've got somebody who's willing to own their stuff, somebody who's willing to keep working on themselves. And then you've got the other person in the relationship who's not as keen on that. And so they're kind of staying stuck in wherever they are on their human journey. And if they're not doing introspective work, you're doing a ton of introspective work. And now you're coming together into the relationship. Sometimes, and I've noticed this in many relationships in my life, that sometimes you feel like you're the hardest working person in the relationship and it becomes difficult. But yet when you look at that on the flip side of relationships is really honoring and letting somebody be who they are and not trying to turn them into on onto your passions.
Right.
So do we have any like tried and true ideas on how we take the entity of relationships and really pour into that entity so that both people in the relationship can grow as humans?
Yeah, such a good question. And I would imagine a conundrum that many people face is this idea that I feel like I'm the one leaning in. I'm the one suggesting the book or the podcast or the course or the therapist or whatever it is. And that you'll notice is often true in relationship, is that there's one person who's sort of more extended and the other person who's more shelled up. And there's lots of different language for that. There's the term overfunctioning versus underfunctioning. You might think of one as being anxiously attached and the other one avoidantly attached. And so when we consider that, one thing I would always invite someone who seems to be the one constantly growing and changing and then being like, hey, do you want to come along? The first part is that a pattern? Like, is that a childhood pattern? Were you trying to take care of other people, help people, change people, heal people? Because what happens is we overextend ourselves and send this invitation, and then we're continuously disappointed when they don't show up.
Yeah.
And that, if we look, is that a familiar feeling that you had as a kid where people weren't showing up? You desperately wanted someone to. Maybe you became a perfectionist. Maybe you're now a therapist, a coach, a caregiver, because that's so often the pattern is like you become and start to monetize the very survival strategy that you had as a kid.
Fascinating.
Right. So I would say most people that are in caretaking roles generally came to that from the experience of overfunctioning as a kid. Survival, right? So it comes from survival.
Wow.
I want to maintain this environment. I want to maintain safety. And if I take care of everyone, maybe that'll help. And, it's just a natural skill set we move towards. So the first part is the recognition of the pattern. The second part is I recognized this when I was healing anxious attachment and healing this chasing my partner is I remember thinking, well, gosh, if I keep inviting her to show up differently, but I keep standing in the space that she needs to step into, then how can she? And I think it's on like a micro level, that's, hey, I'm texting this person who hasn't responded yet. Let them have the space to move towards you. When we think about the third entity, I think about it also as this sacred space between us and other. And it is this invitation for them to stand fully in that space too. So if I keep doing everything for another person, they never have to become an adult. If I keep doing everything for them, they never actually have to do it for themselves. And then I resent them that I'm doing everything. But meanwhile, I'm the one doing everything.
Right.
So this sense of radical responsibility is like, oh, wait, what's familiar for me is leaving myself. What's familiar for me is being disappointed. I say, hey, read this book. This would help us. For when we start to actually step back from that, we say, hey, I learned this thing. I found it really helpful for me to be able to understand us. And I really want to create just a deeply connective relationship with you. And is that something you're interested in?
So beautifully said.
Well, a different way, because what you're doing is most of us shrink and continue to reach down to pull up instead of saying, hey, like you kind of think about it like two adults facing each other. Instead of infantilizing your partner by treating them like a child, you're like, hey, show up, come over. And here's the invitation. And sometimes I remember asking Julie Gottman and John Gottman this. They wrote a book called 7 First Dates, 70. I can't remember, but it's an incredible book and it's 7 essential conversations all couples should have. And I said, well, if the other person doesn't accept the invitation to read the book, that's a red flag, right? Like you should kick them to the curb. And she was like, Mark, no. I still remember.
That's a red flag.
Yeah, she was like, you should get curious as to why they're resistant about them. Maybe they have another avenue they'd rather learn through. Maybe they're scared of what it's going to bring up for them. But at the end of the day, the truth is that you can only invite people to show up. And there will be a timeline where you can no longer wait. And after you wait past that timeline, the cost starts to become your own physiology.